Okay, hey everybody. It is another Wednesday, and it is again 6:30, as it is wont to do every day. And so it's time for the Basic Prep Office Hours stream problems, whatever. Um, I don't mean to say that we are going to be imprecise in what we do. It's just that the categories of what we do is going to be imprecise, mostly because it's determined by whoever is here and whoever has a question. Now, if nobody has a specific question, that's cool. However, it is going to help if you have one, because the only other thing that I saw on Slack recently was a gentleman was asking about what was his deal? He was basically saying that like when you're working on these problems, and he's got a good point, right? Oh, wake up. I'll just go into any of them. And he's suggesting that there's too much space over here and that this input window is too small. And the idea would be there should be a way for us to adjust that using JavaScript. I have no idea how to do that, but you could certainly spend a worse hour than trying to figure out how to do that. And that's my time, which is to say, like, I would have fun doing that. But that said, if somebody has another question that's actually about the course or a problem they want me to run through or an issue that they had with their code, please feel free to send it in Slack. Otherwise, it's probably going to be me as I fail to do this thing, because one of the things that seems easy about this, it's like, okay, well, clearly there's a defined border with this kind of like window, and it should be able to be extended over this way. However, I don't have any idea how to do that, so it is entirely possible that it would just be a long, hour-long, well, it'd be an hour long of me being like, oh, that doesn't work, oh, let's try this, oh, fiddlesticks, as I'm wont to say when I'm trying not to swear on live stream. Ah, good, somebody's typing, so hopefully that'll be a question that is not, let's watch me fail to use JavaScript properly. Mostly because, well, there's two versions. One is the skills necessary to make this code happen in the first place, and then there's the quote-unquote skills necessary to like adjust portions of it. There's actually a portion in the course that's like that. Could you spend some time on generating unit tests? It seems to be one of the things that I'm struggling with. Absolutely. So the question is, could you spend some time on, I just read it out. I'm thinking about trying to get a different way to get the questions available after the fact. I'm not sure if I'm going to do it this time, but I might create like a gist of all the questions so that the stream saved video is a little bit more useful. But okay, unit tests. Unit tests come into play in Module 2. One thing that is underrated, which is, it's my fault that it's underrated because I moved it all over here. In the reference answers and in-depth documentation, there's articles on testing and a bunch of other stuff. So these are just the solutions, but this is an article that's actually on testing and how to come up with unit tests and stuff like that. This would be a very, very useful thing to check out. However, there's a lot of variability in what you can actually do in terms of what a unit test looks like, what an assertion looks like. So that would be like the one idea for later, is you might want to check out this article. Why is that not secure? That's weird. I disagree. You should be secure. Okay, that's odd, but we won't worry about it for right now. So let's come back here. A good one to do the unit test stuff is for the skeletons. Maybe, average is a good one. Average is a good one, and the only reason that average is a good one is because we have a function that they want us to write, and the function is going to make use of another function that we're also going to write, which that's about as clean a reason for unit tests as I could picture, because it might be the case that by unit testing your sum function, you would be able to use it in other instances other than just the average function. So here's the skeleton, and the skeleton again is just an outline of what we're going to do. So for the person who asked that question, do you have a preference about whether you want to write the tests first or write the tests afterwards? And it occurs to me that it might be a little bit annoying to keep answering those questions one-on-one, so I'm just going to assume that you want me to write the tests first, because theoretically that is a form of development. For assertion functions to be used. So let's think about when we're crafting our assertion functions, what I've been writing them after. Oh, okay, that's probably something that's helping you struggle with it, which is to say it's making your struggle more significant, because thinking about unit tests before you start writing the code is, well, it's weird, because some people will suggest that that is the exact way you want to think about it. Other people will suggest that that's an annoying way to think about it. So there's certainly a little bit of controversy is probably too heavy of a word, but there's disagreement. But there's disagreement with everything in software engineering. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to figure out what kind of assertion functions I need to use. And the reason I'm going to do that first is because I can do that right now. I know that my average function is going to return the average of an array of numbers, which is going to be a number. And I know that the sum of an array of numbers is also going to be a number. That means that the result of my functions are going to be a scalar type, which means that assert equal is going to be the most useful one for us to use. Useful? More like applicable. I don't remember what order I put these in when I wrote the other parts of the course, so if this is reverse order with the actual and expected, my apologies. I'll say if actual is equal to expected. At some point in the chat, somebody pasted a cool thing about the difference between triple equals and double equals, so check out that if you get some interest. I'm going to use ES6 string interpolation just because it's cool. If you don't know what I'm doing here, just follow along and send a message in the chat and I'll explain what the difference between this and using double quotes or single quotes is. Essentially, it allows you to insert the value of a variable into a string without having to worry about the pluses and the spaces and all that kind of stuff. So in the event that they are not equal, we want to console.log, I think it's like failed. And then here's where we would do our like plus, but instead of a plus, we literally can just write this $sign, open curly brace, close curly brace, and that's how we're going to interpolate the value of the test name in there. Then we're going to do the same thing for what do you call it? Actual and expected. I forget what it's supposed to look like. Console.log failed. I think it's like, is there a comma? Oh, we're about expected. I think they want quotes. We'll put quotes there. And it's like, but got. We probably want quotes around the other side. Well, quotes might be confusing actually, so let's make it a colon. Sorry, I'm also super slow at typing it because I never do it. And I'm just not that fast at typing. Okay, so expected, but got, expected. All right, cool. The next thing we're going to do is when we organize our test cases, we need a couple of things in order for the test cases to run, right? We need like an input. So let's say that we'll say like tests for sum. So the first thing that we could do would be say something like how are we on var versus let? Do we like var or let today? Excellent point. Let's use var. So we'll say var input is going to be equal to, and we'll just enter a bunch of values that we can quickly calculate the sum of. And so for those of you who cannot quickly calculate the sum of that, it's 15. For those of you who can, well done. And then we're going to say something like variable output is equal to sum on input. And in a moment, we're going to change the names of these variables because we'll find out that we have several inputs and several outputs. However, we could also do something called wrapping this in a function, which is, that's just another way to do it. So variable input is equal to that, variable sum is equal to that, and then the first test is going to be just a call to my assert equal function. Now, this is less of a test and more of an assertion. I'm asserting that the result of calling the function with this specific input is this specific output. The nuances of the differences there that's the article that we referenced earlier. You want to go ahead and read that article and it'll give you a nice breakdown of all the differences, but for now, let's just assume that we only need to write an assertion. And actually, now that I think about it, input might be a little bit, well, not enough, right? We'll say input sum 1. That'll be fine. And since we're writing JavaScript, we'll write it in camel case. The other version is snake case. That's snake case when you do this. Is it? Yeah, snake, because it's like slithering on the ground like a snake, I think. And then camel kind of looks like a camel because the first word in a multi-word variable is lowercase, the rest of them are uppercase. Input sum 1 is going to be this, and we'll say actual sum 1. Cool. So what we've done now is we've created a variable actual sum that's going to be the result of actually calling our function. Actual sum 1. And it just occurred to me, we write these differently than they're actually written in the course. Now that I think about that, that's probably extraordinarily confusing. If you're in the actual input window and you look at the failure messages that come out here, they're different than the way we have you set up the test function. Didn't notice that before. But that's okay. Sometimes the obscurity of the course is on purpose, just because software engineering is really difficult, and the quicker you get used to paying very close attention to all the details, the better. So let's just create a variable for expected sum1 as well, just so we can work with variables. Let's say expected sum1, and then the test name could be returns correct sum of an array of positive integers. Now, the reason that test name is so robust is because what I'm trying to indicate is the idea that a thorough test suite should theoretically apply the same set of tests for a range of possibilities. So maybe it gets the correct sum of an array of positive integers. Maybe it also gets the correct sum of an array of decimal point numbers, or floating point numbers. There's some negative numbers in there. It's not really going to change, but that's the idea. You want to think of categorical reasoning applied to your test cases so that you can cover as much as possible. Okay, so that's the test for sum. Now, what I was talking about earlier with the whole wrapping all of this in a function is that here's what that is. So we could just do this, right? And then write our sum function, and if it works, then this will pass. In fact, we should probably just go ahead and do that. Yeah, let's use a for loop. But we'll use let just to mess with stuff. Let sum equal, let result equal 0. Return result. Okay, cool. So that's our sum function. And also, I'm not going to pseudocode or spend much time on that because the main questions seem to be about unit tests. So I'm assuming that you understand how this works. If not, please mention something in the chat and we'll go back and chat about it. And so let's run this. And I think that this should just say something like passed, but it's entirely possible that it won't, but it does. Excellent. So that's one thing. But it's like, I don't really know what this means, right? Like, it's like passed could be a reference to really anything. And so there's a couple different ways for us to get around this, and there's a couple ways that we're going to sort of ignore it. One of the ways where we would ignore it, it's like, let's say that you had 100 tests. Most of the time, you're really just going to want to know if something failed. And if it failed, what failed? Not necessarily like, okay, it passed this test and it passed that test. Because if you're writing the test, you could be relatively confident that the tests are going to do what you told them to do. Real quick, there was a mention of putting this all in a function, so let's just go ahead and do that. We'll say function test sum function. So I've been writing more Python than I usually do recently. Some test sum function, and literally all we're going to do here is wrap all of this in a function. That's it. So what happens now when we run it is nothing. And the reason is that none of the code inside of our function, our test function, is actually running. So what we could do is we could do a couple of tests inside of here. You know what, I'm getting off base here. Let's go back. We'll leave this just as one test, but the other version would be you just say test sum function. So now that we're calling the function, it's going to run the code that we created inside of it, and we get the same result. So now that we have tested sum properly, it's time for us to test average. And yeah, okay, so average is cool, right? Because it lets us use our sum function. So we can basically say we want to return the average in an array of numbers. The average of an array of numbers is going to be the sum of those numbers divided by the length. So we'll say return sum numbers divided by numbers.length. However, we're not going to do that yet. We need to get our test going for average. Since I am super lazy, I'm a big fan of doing this. And if you've done the course, you know, because there's times when it looks like, wow, somebody totally just copy and pasted this. And yeah, I did. So we'll say input average. And we are likely going to get a misspelling somewhere, but that's okay. And our expected average cannot be 15. It's got to be 3. Returns the correct average of an array of positive integers. And then test average function. This is just one way to do it. The biggest thing you want to keep in mind about testing is that all you are doing is simulating something that is going to happen when your code is in production. and proving to yourself in some capacity that you have a reasonable expectation of that being the case. So that's pretty much it for tests. If I run this, I'm going to see pass twice. Oh, good. Failed. Returns. See, you can picture that if I had a range of like 50 passes and then all of a sudden I had one failed, it's much easier for me to see this failed because it's, bold and all that. Okay, so got undefined. That may be because I wrote the function and then deleted it. So if we come back up here to where we had written our function, anyway, return some numbers divided by numbers dot length. Now when we run that, we're going to see passed. So you might picture that like a unit test. Actually, I always get this confused, so let's just go to the docs. No, it's too far. It's inexplicably non-secure. Yeah, why? Why is it non-secure? I don't necessarily know why that's happening. That's okay. So this article on testing is definitely going to be your best bet. So we're talking about a style of automated test, in particular a style called a unit test. Cool. What's a unit test? A reliable system is composed of reliable components. A Lego block doesn't suddenly change shape on you. It maintains a clear and unchanging interface. You can rely on that interface as you snap that Lego block together with other Lego blocks and thereby build a very complex block structure. That's what I should have said. The components of your program need to behave similarly to Lego blocks. If they honor their contracts with each other, then you can build up a very complex software system with them. If they don't, however, then everything will turn into an unmaintainable mess. Okay, so that's what unit tests do, is essentially make sure that every portion of your program is working correctly. And so that's what we're doing by testing, sum and then average. For our purposes here, the most fundamental unit test in your programs right now is a function. So a unit test essentially means I test a function and prove to myself that it indeed works, given various inputs. Yeah. I would definitely read this article, maybe another one on test-driven development, but that's pretty much the long and short of testing, is you're going to take a practice run, as it were, just to make sure that everything goes correctly, and that if there are problems, you fix them before they become major problems. So probably going to end that there just because, that's pretty much the end of the concept. For the person who asked the question on Slack, I would hope that kind of delivered what you were looking for. However, if that was not it, or you're still confused, please let me know. I do have a tendency to think that I have explained something correctly when all I've done is just kind of wander around it. Excellent. And also, if ever there's a question that you don't really want to ask in front of everybody else, always feel free to DM me during these, whenever, but also during these streams. Sometimes people get a little bit nervous about posting in the general channel. You shouldn't, but that's okay. Like, definitely feel free to DM me if you've got a question that's like, hey, I'd rather not, boast to everybody that this is my, question or whatever. However, I would say that getting used to being slightly embarrassed in front of other people is a good thing because, it's not nearly as embarrassing for other people won't judge you nearly as much as you would judge yourself for being like, oh no, I asked a dumb question. Now, there's of course some limits to that, but in general, there really aren't any dumb questions for this because software engineering is going to involve a very, very wide array of skills. And if you don't have them and you're trying to practice them, the questions you're going to ask are going to sound kind of silly. But if you don't ask those questions to figure out the basics, then you'll never really get past that basics level, which can be frustrating. Excellent question, though. Unit tests are something that are... It's weird because we teach you a very contrived version of it. And eventually you're going to find out that there are things called test suites, which is like a program or like how do you describe this? It's almost similar to like a library, but it's basically like a collection of functions that you can use to test your code, given that people know how you're going to test previously. So what I mean by that is that when we do testing, we show you how to do testing for 2 scalar values, and then 2 arrays with scalar values, and then 2 objects. And when you read on the objects part, you'll find out that that's not really how you test objects. And there's a bunch of reasons why. But what we're getting you used to is the idea of what testing is as a concept. And then later on, when you have kind of a more automatic way to do it, it's a little bit easier. In fact, that's kind of the way that most of the course is set up, as well as the immersive course, is that you tend to learn how to do something in a rather basic or made it by scratch function or fashion, and then later you find out that like, oh, okay, well, you and 50,000 other programmers have been working all the time on this, way more than 50,000, but like a lot of other programmers have applied themselves to this problem before, and so they came up with something called an assertion library, which is a collection of functions that will allow you to, well, because we do rather basic functions, it's mainly just input and output, but sometimes you'll want to test rather complex situations, and those assertion libraries sort of take that into consideration and give you the opportunity to do that. An assertion library that could be very fun to look at is Chai.js. I think this is part of the, what's it called? Pre-course for Hack Reactor. And yeah, it's essentially a way for you, you can see how we're starting to like, expect. So essentially Chai gives you access to something called this expect. It's like, it's a module kind of, also this is why I teach var still, because if all you learned was let and const and you came here and you saw this, you'd be like, oh no. But if you know var and then you see let, it's usually a little easier to go that way than the other way. Can you go through objects, specifically constructors for methods and prototypes? I can, but I'm going to wait to see if there are any other questions just because that is the least important part of the prep course. The only reason that I say that is because JavaScript has 18 different ways to do everything. One of the ways to make objects and everything is, there's something called object-oriented programming. But it's one of those where it's like, that's one way to do it. There are other ways, and then JavaScript invents new ways to kind of circumvent those other ways to do things. I think one of the things they have you do in the immersive is you create a bunch of data structures, but you do it in like 7 different instantiation styles. So there's like pure functional, functional shared, pseudo-classical. There's actually like a class system now. The best I could probably do would be to come to, where did I put that one? How about I didn't get rid of it? Ah, yes. So the render phone number formatter is the closest I could imagine we would get to constructors and methods and prototypes. So to the person who asked that, are you looking for something specific, or is it just like a general chat about it as we walk through this render phone number formatter? I keep saying formatter because that's what the problem eventually asked you to do, but this is that section. It's like an optional about object-oriented programming in JavaScript. And I would say that if you are still aiming for the TAA, if you have not already passed it, it might not be a good idea to worry about this just yet. However, worrying about stuff you don't have to yet is like a developer kind of axiom. So excellent. I can do a general review. Cool. So I'm going to start by reading this just to kind of remind myself of what I wrote because I haven't done this in a while. But object-oriented programming in JavaScript. This program delves into a topic that we have not discussed yet. Oh boy. Object-oriented programming in JavaScript is something that we will not go over directly during this course. However, the idea is relatively straightforward. Not really. Consider the case wherein we wish to create multiple objects, all of which have a relatively similar structure. We are also going to, rather than declaring functions that we have previously, assign properties of the prototype to be functions. Now, that probably doesn't mean anything yet, but a lot of times when you're reading docs, and I do that on purpose, read even if you don't get what the words say. There'll be a little kind of flag in your brain for those words that if you see them again and then a third time, it'll start to make more sense than if you just keep glancing over and be like, oh, I don't understand what that is, I'll come back to it later. A, you never come back to it later. And B, why not just read it the first time? Even if it sounds like it's like Greek. Unless you speak Greek, in which case maybe it sounds like Hindi. And for those of you who speak Greek and Hindi, maybe you wouldn't have as much trouble learning JavaScript because coming from a linguist background. Okay, so a commonly used example for object-oriented is creating virtual cars. They always do this. So for constructor functions, this is a constructor function. We say function car, it's usually capitalized, and then they give you some kind of like inputs for it. So it says this is a constructor function. We will use it to create new instances of our cars. Real quick, you may or may not have seen this before. That's a thing. Here's my array. And it's like, okay, so what is this new doing and what is this array? This is the array constructor function, and this is the new keyword that essentially tells the array constructor function to do some stuff. Why you would need to know this right now is beyond me. but you might need to know it. You will need to know it eventually. So there's no need to kind of like beat around the bush too much. But this is where this is coming from. This is kind of like the base that we're operating off of. So okay, so we have a function car, and we're saying this. We haven't really come across this yet, but we are now. It says this color is equal to color, this dot type is equal to type, and this dot gas is equal to gas. And we're going to set, oh no, sorry, is equal to 12. Below are methods that we've attached to the car's prototype chain. Car.prototype.drive is equal to a function, this dot gas minus equals 1. Car prototype.paintJob is a function that takes in a color, or it's a method, but it's a function as well. This dot color is equal to color. So okay, so we have some code. If we don't understand exactly what that code is, the best bet is to paste it into a code editor and start messing with it. So in order to make use of this set of code, excellent, that was just what I was wanting to do. We have to create a new instance of our car. So you just saw me create a new instance of the array constructor function. We're going to do the same thing with car. So as we see, the var myCar is equal to new car, and we're passing in 2 arguments for each of the parameters required. Say the color is blue, sedan is the type. So let's go ahead and bring this over to Replit. All right, I see your question, and I will get to that very shortly. We're going to finish this up and then chat about that. Although, actually, how much time do you have to? I think your deposit maybe lasts for like 6 months. Definitely check with your enrollment advisor, especially during what's going on right now. They love helping people out with this kind of stuff. The only problem that we are trying to avoid is coding is a habit. So the longer you go without having been proven to us that you can make the material work for you, the more likely it is that you are going to not enjoy the course as much, which is to say not get anything out of it, waste money, waste time, extra stress. So if they do make you redo it, it's usually because students who have spent that long waiting end up, kind of fumbling the first couple of days of class. I'll touch on that more if that was not enough, but I figured that was a primer. You might need to get out of here. So, okay, so now we can create a new instance of car using constructor function. So this is that new keyword. And okay, so let's run and we'll see what happens. So we have my car is a car, which is weird, right? Because it's like, why does it say car? And it's like, that's what the constructor function does. And it also has to do with the way that the output here is working. Actually, let's scroll this over because it's not 1, 2. Right? So here's the weird part. What's essentially happening here is, actually, I think I wrote this down. Cool. I did write it down. So picture that when we say new car blue sedan, so basically this part, what we're assigning to be car, here's what's happening inside of the constructor function. It actually implicitly creates a variable called this. This is a context object, and correct, it is relatively complicated. What it more or less does is it creates an object that we then attach properties to, color, type, and gas, and then it returns it. So what's being returned from this constructor function when we say new is this very specific creation of a this object and an implicit return of it. So then when we return it, we then have this car object, which has a color and a type and a sedan and all that good stuff. All right. So for now, struggling through and playing with the code provided in the exercise below should be enough of an introduction to this topic. We'll go into more detail as the immersive program unfolds. Let's point to one tangible example, which is even though we do not have assigned method drive to our car instance, because we have attached it to the prototype for car, each new instance of car has access to the methods attached to its prototype. Okay, I don't like the way that was worded, but that's okay. So essentially what we're doing here is we're going to call a method called drive. And so as you can see, there is no drive method here. Like we haven't said this.drive is equal to something, but we have said car prototype.drive is equal to this function. What's going to happen when I say mycar.drive is it's essentially going to look in my car and it's going to be like, hey, I don't have a method called drive. I don't have a property called drive. I don't know what this guy's up to. Hey, prototype, do you have any idea what he's talking about? And then the prototype will be like, oh yeah, totally. There's this drive function. You basically want to take whatever your context's gas value is and subtract or set it equal to what it was minus 1, meaning we're just assuming that the gas goes down by 1 unit when we drive. So gas is equal to 12. We're going to hit drive on line 22, and then we're going to find out what the car looks like after we've driven. Okay, so we've got the car, and then after driving, the gas has now gone down by 1. That's about the long and short of it. There's this thing called the prototype chain. It allows you to attach methods so that they can be shared amongst a bunch of other objects. So if we create new cars, we don't want those cars to be reliant on the same, well, see, that's the thing. It's like we don't want them to be reliant on the same set of methods. That's a trade-off, and it's like a consideration that some people will be like, no, we do for this instance. So that's why there's like 7 different ways to do it, and why you'll never really get a perfect, this is the way that you should do, because each one of them has trade-offs and that the other ones don't. What I'm referring to is that we could absolutely create all of the methods inside of here. We could say this.drive is equal to a function, this.drive is equal to a function, this.gas minus equals 1. That would do the exact same thing. What we're doing here is trying to demonstrate what the idea of the prototype chain is, and so we've kind of done that. To the person who is asking about specific constructors and methods and prototypes and stuff, is this explanation sufficient, or would you like to go on to the rest of it? Also, I heard about that funding thing. That's a heartbreaker. However, they are working on trying to get the GI Bill, I think, working. And I'm not really sure that I'm even supposed to be saying anything about it because I have nothing to do with the teams that are responsible for that, but they are very aware that that had happened. We are, sorry that that's the way that it's going, but we are working on alternate solutions for people, so definitely try to contact your admissions enrollment advisor or whoever. They should be able to give you some assistance, and yeah, it's just a bummer. That's one of those where it's like, there's really no other way to say it. Anyway, so that's pretty much it. The person who asked about this seems to have said that that is okay for now, which is excellent. It might just mean that they're like, wow, I'm not listening to your explanation anymore because I am more confused than when you started, which is okay because it happens. And this prototype thing is something that the more familiar you get with objects and functions, the easier this starts to get, because the only part of this that doesn't really happen inside of the code is that implicit creation of a this object that then gets returned, and then the idea of how it looks at the prototype versus methods that are in its own, context. All of that is going to be, gone into in more depth as you go on, and yeah, I'd say it's probably sufficient for now. No, I've been listening. Oh no, I'm sure you have been listening. I'm being facetiously self-deprecating about my explanation skills. I am fully confident that you're taking the steps that you would want to. I'm merely suggesting that my explanation can sometimes be a little bit meandering, and so thus difficult to understand. So var sum array is equal to an empty array. I think I know what you're going to type next. It sounds like you're going to type and var sum array is equal to new array are the same thing. So just for those of you who can't see the chat right now, it looks like we're saying var sum array is equal to this, and var sum array is equal to new array, like that. Yes, for every possible way to think about it, for now, those do the exact same thing. The weird part is that sometimes you'll be in a version of JavaScript or in a context or an environment that doesn't have access to certain portions of this, and we are very closely, we are skating very closely to the area of software engineering that I am not competent to explain. But I am aware that there are issues that you can face with certain runtime environments, depending on whether you're on like the back end or the front end. So you kind of want to keep an eye out for. This is one of those instances where like looking up best practices is a very, very useful way to start any coding project. It's like, okay, so I need to do a project that requires this technology and this technology. So why don't I just look up some best practices for it? Usually, unless it's a brand new technology, a bunch of people have run into problems with it before, and they'll have ideas about like, hey, this is what I think the best practices are. You should load your functions first, or you should make sure that you name this way, or this error tends to happen when you blah, 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 blah. So cool, great question. Because the question that always occurs to everybody is like, why both? And I don't really have a good answer to that. It's cool because it's like JavaScript was invented in I think like 1995 to 98 to be able to manipulate stuff on a web page. That's it. So it didn't even have arrays. Arrays tend to be the idea of referencing a contiguous block of memory in an actual computer structure. However, we've kind of gotten away from that for a while now. Like most JavaScript situations are not really dealing specifically with contiguous blocks of memory or even blocks of memory per se. It's kind of like a call stack situation. It just, I'm butchering this explanation, but you want to figure that the concept of an array is imported from other languages. And to be sure, that's why we have these weird things like, well, here you go, console.log type of some array. Now, those of you who have seen the course know what's going to happen here, but it's like, it's going to tell me that it's an object. You know what's kind of cool, though? Let's try console.log type of, go on then, my car. It's also an object, which is like, well, what about car? It's a function. So it's like, there's some weird stuff because it's like car is also an object. Like the function itself is an object. Not a ton of fun to think about because it ends up being everything is an object, but they don't all have the same properties as actual objects. Just it's one of those weird things. So cool. So that's pretty much all you would need to know about that. I would also say that watching the video on this might be useful, although this video, because of the way that it's formatted, was definitely made a while ago, so it might not be as good as the other ones. But that said, it definitely does get the job done. So this render phone number formatter one is kind of a more extended version of the one that we just did. It can be very useful to mess with if you like. And to be sure, this is the video that will go through that, not the other one. This one trips people up because they rename a method slice. Like slice for the context of the phone number formatter ends up implicitly slicing from the numbers property rather than being just like a slice function. So that trips a ton of people up. They're like, well, how does it change? And it's like, well, it's because of scope and because of the way that we're organizing things. And as far as I'm concerned, I don't think that's important before the TAA. I would imagine that if you're able to get through the TAA, which tests your ability to kind of solve problems using JavaScript with relatively basic, objects, arrays, functions, if statements, iteration. If you can do all of that and under pressure, the odds of your not being able to get this with proper explanation are pretty low. Okay, so I haven't seen any questions in a while, and what I am assuming is that means that the people who are here either don't have any questions or they're not really interested in asking any questions, or they figured out what they needed to figure out, which is cool. There's a thread here. I wonder if that's to do with this. All right, cool. All right. Well, part of me wants to end the stream now, but another part of me wants to mess with that, width of this because I really have no idea what it's going to look like, and I want to see if I can do it. I would not bet on me though, because, well, I've never done this before. So here's my thinking. My thinking is that there seems to be something orienting all of this in the same format. Everything on the page seems to have this barrier here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right-click on isograms. I'm going to click Inspect. Okay, so it looks like this is my div. That's the troublesome one. So if I click on this, I want to look at, I reorganized this so that it wouldn't be. Box sizing, border box. Yeah, see, we're already into width is 100%. Margin is 0. Display block. Well, let's get rid of this and see what happens. That didn't do anything. What about this? That's our div. A div. Listen. So there's our markdown container. The markdown container is the one that looks like we might have to adjust a little bit, but like I said, I am so bad at this part of things because I just haven't done it. So let's see. Markdown container. I wonder if I just made it. Okay, so that's not going to do it. So that's display none. That's where you basically tell it that you want it to display as nothing. And so that's apparently going to clip the rest of it, which makes sense if you think about it, because that's the container that's holding this container that is too thin. So perhaps we should go back to this container and see how we can make it not margin bottom 60. I don't know, I'm at the wrong one. We want this one. Ooh, display block. Which? Nope, not happening. Invalid property value. Fine. Fine. Leave me alone. Yeah, I think this is a bad idea. I do not think it is a bad idea to try to figure out how to widen that, but I do think it is a bad idea to waste a bunch of time on stream, especially because, well, I don't really have any confidence that I'm going to be able to figure this out just because I haven't done it in a while, or ever when it comes to some of these things. So, probably going to hang around for another couple of minutes just to see if there's any other questions, but to be sure, I know premium prep is currently going on, so I'd imagine that, and also there have been some lockdown restrictions raised, so the same set of people may not be around. Also, I saw that some of those people who were hanging out for the previous streams got in. Congratulations to all of you. But if you are here and you have an additional question, please feel free to send me a direct message, and we can correspond that way. However, I am going to give it another couple of minutes just to, what do you call it? Oh, just to make sure if there's any extra questions. The problem is that I know that this breaks whatever's going on up there. And I know that the way to fix this was to put it inside of a p tag. I'm going to have to think about this one. Also, the fun part is that we have a whole Learn dev team, so it is entirely possible I might just go bother them and be like, hey, can you figure out how to do this? Because, I want you to be comfortable while you're working on the code. Well, I think I'm probably going to call it there. Although I've seen a couple people start typing and then stop. And I hope that's because you just decided that your question was, answered already and not because you were like, oh, no, my pleasure. That's the other thing is that I'm hoping that when people see these streams, they'll just kind of be like, oh, cool, I can message that guy. Because you totally can. And people have been, and so that's awesome. If you have questions, always feel free to just holler. Eventually, I probably will get the hook because I got reassigned to another team. So when that happens, it'll be another person here. But, you're going to be pleasantly surprised about how many people there are in the world of development that just kind of get a kick out of helping people learn stuff that they don't know how to do yet. And this will happen to you. The second you learn how to do anything, not to everybody, of course, but for a lot of people, the second you learn how to do anything, the fun part is to show somebody else, like, hey, this is how you do that. Oh, it's my pleasure. Again, if there's any other questions, if you have any suggestions, this is literally something that I just kind of was like, hey, I want to do this, and didn't really think about any of the details, just sort of did it. So if there's something that's like, oh man, if only somebody would tell him to do this or that, that'd be super helpful to me. I'd love to hear that. I have no real qualms about changing almost anything about the way we're presenting this. Provided that it is giving any person at all any utility, then it's worth it to me because, well, I have a ton of fun doing this. But that said, it might be the case that I am attached to do a version of this that is not as useful to you, or if there's a different time. Always want to hear any possible... Can you work through a quick TAA question? I missed most of the stream. Thanks. Sure. In terms of TAA question, I don't have any TAA questions. The point is that the TAA is questions that you will not have seen in prep, almost exclusively. However, we could probably do a problem that would be of similar difficulty. Maybe find longest palindrome? Let's hope I haven't done it yet. Cool. All right, so we're going to do, I don't remember what kind of test this one has. All right, cool. So this is going to test our palindrome creator. So I'm not going to do the assertion functions. And the reason I'm not going to do that is because we teach you assertion functions because it's a good idea for you to know what they are and how to use them. However, you are not going to need them necessarily on the TAA. And what I mean by that is they might ask you to use them. They might ask you to create them. They might ask you to fix one that is incorrect. But all of that for me falls under the category of like functions. Like if you know how to operate with functions, you'll be fine. So that's why I'm going to be lazy and skip the assertion function portion. And yeah, so let's look at the skeleton. We need to find longest palindrome, split the sentence into words, iterate words and collect the palindromes, sort the list of palindromes by word length, and return the largest item in the sorted list. So I have a function reverse string, got a function isPalindrome, and it says hint, you can detect palindromes by comparing a string to its reverse. So it sounds like reverse string is going to come in useful there. Sort the list of palindromes by word length. That's what this is. And they also want us to know how to use sort. So here's an example of a function that they might give you, which is to say that like you might not know how to use sort until you get onto the interview, but they would give you enough context, at least in their view, so that you should be able to figure out how to make it work. So we're going to also skip that, and this is going to be kind of just like a run through. So isPalindrome, let's start there. And we'll say return word triple equals reverse string for the word. So if the word is equal to its reverse, then we have a palindrome. If it's not, then we'll have not a palindrome. Cool. Returning reversing a string. So you should be able to say string.reverse, but you can't. So what we have to do, or at least what I want to do, is I want to change the string into an array, reverse the array, and then turn that reversed array back into a string. We can actually do that all in one line, and I'm going to. I'm going to say string.split on every character, dot reverse dot join. If you're having trouble with that, the video that I did for this one has much more of like a, what would you call it? It isn't just my doing like, a couple of methods all in a row, but take my word for it, this is how it does. You split the string, this value ends up being an array, we reverse that array, so we have a reversed array with this expression, and then we join that array and return the whole thing. So cool. Find longest palindrome. So split the sentence into words. Excellent idea. It's going to be on a space. You figure like a sentence is going to be a bunch of words separated by spaces. Is there a set of methods you would recommend to know by heart for the TAA? Some of the methods that you see in the course are very useful, but you also want to figure that we could absolutely, let's do this without methods real quick. We'll say for variable I is equal to 0, I is less than string.length. The point I'm trying to make here is that you should memorize some methods that are used in the course, but your skills with what's going on inside of the course should be sufficient to the point where using a for loop, an if statement, should be able to get you what you need. We'll say, go on then, variable result is equal to an empty string. And essentially what we're going to do is we're going to switch this. We're going to say variable I is equal to string.length minus 1, and we're going to say I needs to be greater than 0, and then we're going to say I minus minus. Essentially what we're going to do is we're going to iterate over the string backwards. As we iterate over the string in reverse order, we're going to add to result each current letter. So we'll say result plus equals string at I, and then return result. So we're going to comment this out for now, and then after we prove that our function works, I'm going to show you how that does the same thing. But so that's the corollary to, yeah, you should memorize some methods, split, join. The operators and methods section in Module 0 provides a pretty comprehensive list of most of the methods that you would need. But you'd also figure that you can usually recreate a lot of them. And also, being able to describe exactly what you want a method to do can help. So it's like, I don't know how to do this, but I know if I had a string here, I could separate it into an array values. That tends to be better than if you just look at it and say, I don't know what to do. So hopefully that made some sense. But let's come back here. Split sentence into words. Words is equal to sentence.split. Okay. Iterate words and collect the palindromes. Fair enough. So we'll say variable palindromes is equal to an array. Then we'll say for, I'll use let here just because I feel like it, less than words dot length. And we want to say like if, we've got a function here with is palindrome. Is palindrome is nice because we can just say if is palindrome of words at I. So basically if the current word is a palindrome, then we want to, and it just occurred to me, I'm not writing any pseudocode, which is not a good thing. That's okay. Palindromes.push words at I. You're not going to get in trouble if you don't write pseudocode on the TAA, but you may get into like difficulties. It may end up being more difficult for you if you don't write pseudocode, because especially for beginners, you tend to really like the code that you write, and so if you write pseudocode, it's easier to get rid of code you've written. All right, palindromes.push. Okay, so now palindromes is palindromes is going to be an array of the palindromes. We want to sort that list by length. So this is going to be one of those where you're going to take my word for it, or if you want to, you can look it up here. But there's a method called sort. We can pass a function to sort that tells it how to sort. And we've already given you that function. Sort ascending by length is what's called the compare function. When you look this up, which I keep saying when you look this up, let's just look it up. Yeah, sort. So it sorts it in place. So it's essentially a way for us to sort things. The details of how it actually works sometimes take this thing called a compare function. And a compare function gives you a way to say, I want you to compare them in this fashion. This is a very, very, very good beginner documentation. Doesn't seem to have as much like crazy stuff that you would not need to worry about as a beginner. Mostly this walks you through a very nice way to understand what a compare function is and how to pass it to sort. So highly recommended. But let's come back here and assume that it's working, and we'll just say palindromes dot sort, and it sorts it in place. What we mean by that is we don't have to say variable new palindromes or sorted or whatever. Boy, I hope I'm saying this right. Sorted is equal to, we don't have to do that. We can just say palindromes dot sort and then pass in our function sort ascending by length. Sort ascending by length is going to sort the palindromes ascending by length. So if they're ascending by length, the first, second, third, they're all going to be the shortest palindromes, and then as we get to the end of our palindromes array, those are going to be the longest ones. So I have at this point, I'll go back, I have at this point an array of palindromes called palindromes. They're sorted so that the longest one is going to be at the end, and I want the longest one. So I'm going to return palindromes.pop. Okay, cool. So we've got all of our function written out. Let's go ahead and run it and see what we did wrong. Okay, cool, we didn't do anything wrong. So I promised that we would come back up here and change this, so let's go ahead and change it. Let's say that we forgot about split, reverse, and join. You're going to have a tough time if you forget all of those, but let's say it happens. Here I know that I can iterate over a string. I can do it selectively because I'm cool like that. And, oh, good. So we did this totally wrong. All right, so reverse is equal to result string.length equal to 1, I is greater than 0. I is greater than 0. Does anybody know why I is greater than 0 is the problem here? Agreed. We actually need I to be equal to 0 at the end of this. We need the last value that I occupies to be 0. So if the for loop stops when I is equal to 0, we're in trouble. So we got to make that I is greater than or equal to 0. Oh, thank goodness. There is nothing worse than seeing those failed tests on a stream, especially because I experienced a rather brutal attempt at a problem that somebody was like, hey, can you do this problem? And I thought I could, and I could not. And I spent like an hour and a half just butchering it. That problem is actually in the course now because it was a result of trying to do too much work at once and not having the, what's it called, good sense to take a break and eat some food when you're having trouble. Cool. So yeah, that's an example of a problem that is around the difficulty of the TAA. Now, how the TAA exactly goes is it's going to be difficult, right? Like it's a test, and what you're doing in the prep course is preparing for that test. So in terms of methods and stuff like that, repetition is your best friend. The more you do these problems, the more resources that you try to seek, Code Wars, any of the problems in here, all the problems section in Module 0, there's a bunch of problems in Module 2, Module 3. I've even started loading in some problems in a module that I'm calling TAA, so Advanced Pre-Assessment Practice. This has a bunch of problems either repeated from earlier in the course or from other places. Practice as many of those as you possibly can. It's also a very good idea to start recording yourself solving problems. The more you get used to the idea of you're being recorded while you solve problems, the less jarring it's going to feel when that actually happens during the TAA. So that, and when you're going to the TAA, make sure that you have a good night's sleep beforehand, make sure that you eat something. Try to organize things so that you can be at your computer, but don't code up to the interview. Don't sit down like an hour beforehand and get warmed up. That's the metaphorical equivalent of jogging to the start of a marathon. It's just you practice for the marathon for months beforehand, and then on the day of you kind of take it easy because you got to run 26 miles. That's very similar to what's going on with the TAA and like coding to get warmed up for it. It's weird because it's not the kind of thing you can cram for. And if you end up cramming for it in passing, you tend to have shot yourself in the foot a little bit, possibly. The idea would be that you don't want to game this test because this test is trying to make sure that you're not going to give away a ton of money and not get anything out of it. So that sounds more like an admonishment than I wanted it to be. What I'm suggesting is that like your best friend is the TAA. Like the TAA is what ensures that you are not going to be wasting your money. And so in that case, combined with the fact that you are going to need to take one of these kind of technical interviews to get a technical position, there's a bunch of reasons why we have it, but that's starting to sound kind of ramblish to me. But anyway, is there any final questions or thoughts? Because we were about to leave, but then there was an excellent question about working through a problem, and we did that. So other than that, I would want to make sure that anybody who is here is not just like, oh my God, I've been waiting for this stream all week, and all I wanted you to do was whatever. Because, as we have shown, there's not really anything I'm attached to doing for this. We can kind of chat to make sure that you guys are on the level. Oh, also, I should totally mention something. Any and all comments that I make about the TAA, sorry, not the TAA, vet tech funding, GI Bill, any of that stuff that has to do with like official admissions enrollment stuff, take it all with like the biggest grain of salt in the world. I know very, very, very little about what's going on there. They tell me some stuff, but it is not the case that you should consider anything that I've said to be fact or to be like okay, cool. Just because one of the things that's very important about a company like ours, which is to say a for-profit education company, is we do not want to get on the bad side of regulators. And sometimes things that can seem like they're innocuous can flirt with that. And the regulators are a very good portion of this because it makes sure that no matter what happens, no matter who's running the company or who's involved with it, the core of it is, do we get students good results after the fact? And if we don't, well, then we shouldn't be doing what we're doing. And I think that there are a lot of companies that do that, but the regulations that we adhere to tend to make it the case that that just isn't what we do. Like we're much more in the business of making people lifetime, Hack Reactor or Galvanize, fans, as opposed to just being like, hey, let's make sure that your check clears and then you're on your own. Because that's an approach to take, right? Anybody can come to your program just as long as they pay. And there are programs out there like that, and they work for some people. But I've heard a lot of people suggest that the tone, or kind of like the feeling that you get, isn't the same as with a place like Hack Reactor, where everybody you're going to be in class with has passed a certain level of like interest and talent in this, which means that, whereas you might have been doing this all on your own, you're not collaborating with a bunch of people who have a ton in common with you, but also come from wildly different parts of life. So it's just, I don't know. I'm kind of a fanboy. I really, really enjoyed my time at what was called Maker Square, which then became Hack Reactor, which then became Galvanize. So yeah, again, this is the rambling portion of the stream. For those of you who have seen the ones before, you're probably aware that the first portion of it is nice and directed. Or I should say that when people are asking questions, it's nice and directed, but without a prompt, I tend to get a little bit philosophical, which, I don't know, might not be everybody's cup of tea. Several people are typing. Oh gosh. We come back for the ramble. Nice. Yeah, right? It's cool because, working with people who don't have any like buy-in to something can be rewarding because, maybe they weren't able to afford buy-in, but it can also be a little frustrating because you're not really sure that they have the same level of dedication to things. And especially when it comes time for like working partners or work in a group, it's always nice to know that people you're working with care about it as much as you do, or at least almost as much. Any other resources you recommend? Okay, so let's see. There's several different ways to picture the word resources. So you could picture a resource could be like a canonical JavaScript textbook. And for that, I would say you don't know JavaScript. It's written by this guy called Kyle Simpson. I actually knew him personally at one point because he was involved with Maker Square Hack Reactor. He spends a ton of time writing these books, and they're available. I got signed out of GitHub. Well, that makes sense. But these are all open, like for free. You can just come on here and just check them out. He's got the first editions of the books right here. Like literally, you can read it for free online. Like, and it's this wildly in-depth thing about like, hey, what is my code doing when this happens? And it's like, oh, let me tell you. Now, this is pretty dry though, compiler theory. So it's like, do you really need to know this to be a software engineer? Well, you might want to start, but do you need to get into Hack Reactor and kind of get moving? Probably not. So maybe it would be more fun for you to kind of check out what people can do on the front end when they really can, like, flex their design muscles. So you come to a place like CodePen, and it's like, hey, let's check out topics to explore in front-end development. And people will have like actual code of like, hey, here is how I, please don't be some weird thing. Yeah, cool. So it's like, this is how you make this happen. Here's the code for it. Here's the JavaScript. So you can just kind of mess around with it. And so the idea would be like, maybe you really enjoy front-end stuff, and this would be a good place for you to get started. Whereas if I sent you to you don't know JavaScript, you'd be like, oh, I knew it. I have a design background, and I'm brilliant in making things pretty, but I have no interest in what tokenizing or lexing is, and so I'll never be a software engineer. And it's like, nope, tons of ways to get involved. You also want to figure that there's places like Code Wars. Code Wars would be like, I want to learn how to do technical interview style questions. It's like, all right, come to Code Wars. It gives you this cool UR training, and you do katas and you whatever. You can check out all these languages and kind of mess with them. But then you might be like, hey, I don't really want to just work on that. I want to learn how to build websites. So there's this place called Codecademy. Not Code Academy, it's just Codecademy. I also used to give bonus points on a interview when people would know that it was that, but it doesn't really matter. And this is a place where you could sign up and learn, about HTML and CSS and things like that. Web design. Now, I think they have a paid version that is pretty robust. And machine learning. I would imagine that some of these things might be behind paywalls, but you also want to figure that it can be a fun idea to get involved in this. Now, the last one would be, okay, what if I want to learn about computer science? And my recommendation for computer science is Khan Academy. Khan Academy has an absolutely excellent it has a computer science course that is taught in JavaScript. Free to sign up. I don't think it costs any money to get in there. Very, very, yeah, this guy's just one of those like people that make you feel better about the world. I don't know anything about him besides the fact that he started Khan Academy and that it's free for people. So if he has some kind of terribly dark secret, I'm sorry, I don't mean to be supporting that. But in terms of somebody who went out of their way to give free educational resources, this is the guy. So yeah, those are my tips for like learning. And the other tip would be ask everybody. Ask anybody and everybody, hey, what helped you learn this? Because the idea that there's one way to learn this is the biggest lie ever. There's a gajillion ways to learn it. So trying to find the best way to sort of like wade into the deep end is, that's kind of like half the battle. This is not a learning resource. This is more of just what an assertion library is. Did I already miss the TAA test for this month? I don't think there's a test like once a month. I think you can like sign up for a date. You're going to want to check out admissions.galvanize. Let me send a response to this. Admissions.galvanize.com, or just go to galvanize.com and like go through the application process. I don't think there's one TAA a month. I think there's like a TAA at like lots of different dates, and you can get in almost whenever. There are deadlines though. So if you're trying to go to a specific cohort, there'll be a deadline that's like, hey, you need to interview by this date. That you are going to want to check out, and that would also be on hackreactor.com and galvanize.com. Do you guys teach JavaStack? No, not at Hack Reactor. It's primarily Node.js, but they actually have you do a project with Node.js where you don't use Express. Express is middleware that makes routing in a server on a runtime environment like Node.js much easier. But the first one they have you do doesn't do that. And I think it does a very good job of giving you kind of like a survey of back-end programming and runtime environments for the most part, at least for writing a server from scratch. And that, to me, is usually enough for people to figure out how to use Java after the fact. Also, if you're curious, I think it's, I'm not going to remember this exactly. I think it's Coursera. I think Coursera has a Duke University computer science like introduction course using Java, and it's pretty sweet. Like all the resources are there. There's a couple of bad links, but that happens with all those Java courses. So that would be what I would say check out for Java. Also, if you are curious about Java, here's what I would say. If you've been writing JavaScript and you feel like JavaScript is too forgiving, it's too easy, then check out Java. Because, well, I don't know. I'm biased. I learned Java, and then in my interview for Makersquare, I told the guy that I probably wouldn't have any problems learning JavaScript because I had learned Java. He kind of laughed because he's a sick programmer, and he was like, yeah, Java is like JavaScript the way grape is like grapefruit, which I thought was kind of mildly amusing. They're completely different. JavaScript was named JavaScript to take advantage of the popularity of Java. That's pretty much as far as their similarities go, and the for loops look pretty similar. But the difference that stands out for most people is you see how we're saying stuff like var, oh come on, wake up, var sum array is equal to an array. You don't say var, you would say something like array or int. You know what I mean? Like you can't just say, hey, this is going to be a variable. Java's like, okay, what kind of variable? And if you ever do anything that it wasn't want you to do with that type, it gets very squawky. You also have to compile it, which means that before you run it, you have to kind of like have a program turn your Java into machine code, and then it runs. But that also means that it runs really fast. It can mean that it can run on a lot of different platforms. And I think that the runtime environment for the console is a Java virtual machine. So sometimes when you get an error in the console, it'll say something like JVM. Of course not. But anyway, sometimes it'll say that. JVM usually means the Java virtual machine, which is to say it's like a, you know what, I'm not going to try to explain what a virtual machine is in a couple of minutes. So cool. So that is more or less time. For the people who asked questions or had some issues, is everybody, at least temporarily satisfied with answers that they received? And of course, if you're not, please feel free to send me a direct message or send a message in the chat afterwards. We usually sweep through and make sure that anybody who has questions gets them answered. And, thanks for watching. I hope you have a good one. And I guess we're in good shape. I gotta go back and redo those videos. They're not in linear order. It occurred to me the other day that the jokes about the good shape thing happen before you ever realize that I say we're in good shape at the end of every video. And so I think that's kind of odd for people. I think it might be kind of like jarring. But that's okay. So thank you all so much for watching. I do really appreciate those of you who came and asked questions. I appreciate those of you who came and did not. Please feel free to keep hacking away at your coding journey. No matter what it looks like somebody else is doing in terms of how good they are, you always want to make sure that you keep comparing yourself to your own progress. And just provided that you make it nice and steady, if this is something you want to do and you keep at it, you'll probably end up being able to do it. So from all of us here in my apartment, which is just me, thanks for coming, and we'll see you next week.